What Google has built into every Android smartphone that has ever left a manufacturing facility and been placed into the hands of a consumer who trusted that their device was working for them rather than against them, who assumed that the applications they downloaded were serving their interests rather than surveilling their behavior, who believed that the personal information flowing through their device was protected by the reasonable privacy expectations that every human being deserves to have respected when they use technology that has become as intimate, as personal, and as central to the most private dimensions of their daily life as a modern smartphone has become for the billions of people around the world who carry one in their pocket every waking hour and who depend on it for communication, for information, for navigation, for financial management, for health tracking, for professional productivity, and for every other category of activity that the modern smartphone has made it possible to conduct from a single device that knows more about its owner's daily life, daily habits, daily movements, daily interests, daily communications, and daily personal circumstances than any other object or any other institution that has ever existed in the history of human civilization, is a tracking system of extraordinary sophistication, extraordinary comprehensiveness, and extraordinary commercial value to the advertising industry that has been operating on Android devices since the earliest versions of the operating system, and that most Android users have never examined, never configured, and never even been told about in the kind of clear, prominent, and honest communication that the nature and the extent of what this system does to the privacy and the personal data of every Android user affects absolutely demands from the company that has embedded it so deeply and so persistently into the operating system that powers the smartphones of more than 3 billion people around the world. The Android feature that may be tracking your ad activity, the specific system whose existence most Android users are unaware of and whose configuration most Android users have never reviewed, is the Advertising ID system, sometimes displayed in device settings as the Google Advertising ID or the Android Advertising ID, a unique alphanumeric identifier that Google assigns to every Android device, and that the advertising ecosystem uses to track the advertising-related behavior of the device's user across every application that participates in the advertising network, connecting the dots between the advertisements the user sees in one application, the content they engage with in another application, the products they browse in a shopping application, the searches they conduct in a search application, the locations they visit as recorded by location-enabled applications, and the full spectrum of behavioral signals that the advertising ecosystem harvests from the user's application usage to build the comprehensive behavioral profile that enables the targeted advertising that the Advertising ID system was specifically designed to support. The Advertising ID is distinct from other device identifiers in a way that Google has long argued makes it privacy-respecting. It is a resettable identifier that users can change by accessing the advertising settings on their Android device, creating a new identifier that disconnects the advertising profile built on the old identifier from the new identifier that applications will report to advertising networks going forward. And it can be opted out of entirely on devices running Android 12 or later, which replaced the previous opt-out mechanism with a complete deletion option that prevents applications from accessing any advertising ID at all rather than simply presenting a zeroed-out identifier that some advertising systems could still use for rudimentary tracking. The distinction between Google's characterization of the Advertising ID as a privacy-respecting, user-controlled resettable identifier and the reality of how the advertising ecosystem actually uses this identifier and the data it enables is a distinction that deserves careful examination, because the privacy benefits of resettability and opt-out are benefits that only materialize for users who are aware of the Advertising ID, who understand what it does, who know where to find the settings that control it, and who actively choose to exercise the control options that those settings provide, conditions that are not met for the overwhelming majority of Android users who have never been told about the Advertising ID in the kind of clear, prominent, and urgency-appropriate communication that would prompt them to examine and adjust their advertising settings before the Advertising ID has been used to build a comprehensive behavioral profile of their application usage, their purchasing interests, their content preferences, their location patterns, and every other dimension of their personal behavior that the advertising ecosystem extracts from the data that the Advertising ID enables it to connect and to aggregate across the full range of applications participating in the advertising network on the user's device. The data that the Advertising ID enables the advertising ecosystem to collect and to connect about individual Android users is data of extraordinary personal sensitivity and extraordinary commercial value, a comprehensive behavioral portrait of the user that encompasses their interests as revealed through the content they engage with across applications, their purchasing intentions as revealed through the products they browse and the price points they consider across shopping applications, their health interests and health concerns as revealed through the health and wellness applications they use and the health-related content they consume, their political and social views as revealed through the news sources they follow and the political content they engage with, their relationship status and family circumstances as revealed through the social applications they use, and the demographics of the content they consume, their financial situation as revealed through the financial applications they access and the financial products they research, their location, patterns as revealed through the combination of location data and advertising ID tracking that allows the advertising ecosystem to connect the user's physical movements to their digital behavior in ways that reveal where they live, where they work, where they seek medical care, where they worship, whom they visit, and what their daily routine looks like in granular and personally revealing detail. The commercial ecosystem that the advertising ID supports, the interconnected network of advertising platforms, data brokers, demand-side platforms, supply-side platforms, data management platforms, and the full infrastructure of the programmatic advertising industry that processes advertising ID-linked behavioral data to enable the targeted advertising that generates the revenue supporting the free application economy that most Android users depend upon for the applications they use every day, is an ecosystem of extraordinary scale and extraordinary opacity whose operations most Android users have no visibility into, and whose data practices most Android users have never consented to in any meaningful sense of informed, specific, and revocable consent that privacy law and privacy ethics require for the processing of personal data, of the sensitivity and the comprehensiveness that advertising ID-enabled behavioral tracking produces. The specific applications on any given Android device that are accessing and reporting the advertising ID to advertising networks span virtually every category of free application available in the Google Play Store, because the advertising-supported business model that makes free applications economically viable for their developers is a model that depends on advertising network participation that requires advertising ID access, meaning that the free games, the free social media applications, the free news applications, the free weather applications, the free utility applications, and virtually every other category of free application that the typical Android user installs and uses regularly are applications that are reporting the advertising ID to advertising networks every time an advertising impression is served within the application, creating a continuous stream of advertising ID-linked behavioral data flowing from the device to the advertising ecosystem that persists for as long as the advertising ID remains unchanged, and for as long as the device continues to have free applications installed that participate in advertising networks. The process of checking your Android device's advertising ID settings, the specific navigation path through the Android settings interface that leads to the advertising configuration options, where the advertising ID can be viewed, reset, or deleted, depending on the Android version running on the device, varies by Android version and by device manufacturer's customization of the Android interface. But on most modern Android devices running recent versions of the operating system begins with opening the settings application, scrolling down to find Google in the list of settings categories, or navigating to privacy in the main settings menu, tapping on the Google or privacy section to expand it, finding the ads option within the expanded section, and tapping on the ads option to access the advertising settings page where the current advertising ID is displayed and where the options for resetting the advertising ID, opting out of ads, personalization, or on Android 12, and later completely deleting the advertising ID are available for the user to review and to exercise according to their preferences and their privacy priorities. The option to delete the advertising ID entirely, available on Android 12 and later as a replacement for the previous opt-out mechanism that left the advertising ID in place while theoretically instructing advertising networks to honor the user's opt-out preference, is the most comprehensive and most privacy-protective choice, available to Android users who want to eliminate advertising ID-based tracking of their application usage by the advertising ecosystem, because the complete deletion of the advertising ID prevents applications from accessing any unique advertising identifier from the device, removing the linkage mechanism that allows the advertising ecosystem to connect behavioral data from different applications to build the comprehensive cross-application behavioral profile that advertising ID-enabled tracking produces. The practical consequence of deleting the advertising ID for the user's application experience is primarily that the advertisements displayed within applications will be less targeted to the user's specific interests and behavioral profile, because without the advertising ID-linked behavioral data that targeted advertising depends upon, Advertising networks must serve contextual advertising based on the general content of the application or the general demographics of the application's user base, rather than the specific behavioral profile of the individual user, producing advertising that is less precisely targeted, but that most users will find no less relevant to their actual interests and considerably less unsettling. From the perspective of the apparent surveillance of their behavior that highly targeted advertising can produce when it demonstrates an uncomfortably precise knowledge of the user's recent browsing history, purchase intentions, or personal circumstances. The option to reset the advertising ID, creating a new identifier that severs the connection between the behavioral data collected under the previous identifier and the new identifier that will be reported to advertising networks going forward, is a less comprehensive privacy measure than complete deletion, but represents a meaningful privacy improvement for users on Android versions older than 12 that do not offer the complete deletion option, because it resets the cross-application behavioral tracking from 0 and requires the advertising ecosystem to rebuild its behavioral profile of the user from scratch using the new identifier, providing a temporary privacy benefit whose duration depends on how quickly the advertising ecosystem accumulates sufficient behavioral data linked to the new identifier to reconstruct a behavioral profile comparable to the one that was severed by the reset. The relationship between the advertising ID and the other tracking mechanisms that the advertising ecosystem uses on Android devices, the device fingerprinting techniques that create a unique identifier based on the specific technical characteristics of the device that persists across advertising ID resets and even across factory resets. In some implementations, the IP address-based tracking that allows some level of user identification even in the absence of a device-specific identifier, the probabilistic matching techniques that use behavioral signals to reconnect users with their historical profiles even after identifier resets in the first part. High data collection that individual application developers conduct independently of the advertising ID system illustrates the reality that the advertising ID is one important component of a multi-layered tracking ecosystem, rather than the only mechanism through which Android users are tracked by the advertising industry, and that deleting or resetting the advertising ID, while a meaningful privacy improvement, does not eliminate all advertising tracking of Android device users. The privacy protective steps that Android users should take in conjunction with addressing their advertising ID settings to address the multiple layers of the advertising tracking ecosystem rather than just the advertising ID component include reviewing and restricting the location access permissions granted to applications that use location data as a component of their advertising targeting, reviewing and restricting the access permissions for other sensitive data categories, including contacts, calendar, and health data that some applications use for advertising personalization purposes, enabling the private DNS ad blocking feature that blocks advertising domain requests at the network level as a complement to the advertising ID level protection that the advertising settings provide, using privacy-focused browser settings and browser extensions for web browsing activity that is not protected by the advertising ID changes, reviewing the Google account advertising personalization settings that control how Google uses cross-service data for advertising targeting, in addition to the device-level advertising ID settings that control application-level tracking, and regularly reviewing and revoking application permissions that have accumulated on the device to ensure that applications are not retaining access to sensitive data categories that they collected permission for at installation, but that they no longer need for their current use. The regulatory context in which Google's advertising ID system operates. The data protection frameworks in the European Union under the General Data Protection Regulation, the privacy regulations in California and other U.S. states that have enacted consumer privacy legislation, and the growing international consensus around the need for meaningful consent for the processing of personal data for advertising purposes, is a context that has been generating increasing pressure on Google and the broader advertising ecosystem to provide more meaningful control over advertising tracking to users in jurisdictions with strong privacy regulations, pressure that has contributed to the development of the advertising ID deletion option in Android 12, and to the broader evolution of privacy controls in the Android operating system that has been occurring over recent years in response to regulatory scrutiny, competitive pressure from privacy-focused competitors, and growing public awareness of and concern about the extent of behavioral tracking that the advertising ecosystem conducts on mobile devices. The transparency gap. The difference between what the advertising ID system does to the behavioral data of Android users and what those users understand about it is a gap that this video exists to address, with the kind of clear, specific, and actionable information that every Android user deserves to have about the tracking that is occurring on their device and the options available to them for controlling or eliminating that tracking, because the privacy controls that exist within Android's advertising settings only protect the users who know those controls exist, who understand what they do, who know where to find them in the settings interface, and who exercise them with the informed intentionality that meaningful privacy choice requires. Conditions that the typical Android user, who has never been clearly informed about the advertising ID by Google, by the carrier that sold them their device, or by the manufacturer who built it, simply does not meet without the kind of direct, clear, and specific communication about this feature and these controls that this video is providing. Check your Android device's advertising settings right now. Navigate through the path described in this video to find your advertising ID settings. Review the current state of your advertising configuration. Delete the advertising ID if you are running Android 12 or later, and value your privacy over the marginal relevance improvement that targeted advertising based on your behavioral profile provides. Reset it if you are running an older Android version that does not offer deletion, and take the complementary privacy protective steps that address the other layers of the advertising tracking ecosystem that operates on your device with or without your knowledge, and with or without your meaningful consent. Because the privacy of your behavioral data, the security of your personal information, and the dignity of your right to use your smartphone without being comprehensively surveilled by a commercial tracking system that you were never clearly told about are rights worth exercising. The moment you learn that the controls needed to exercise them exist, and that the 30 seconds required to access them is all that stands between your current state of unexamined tracking and the more privacy protective configuration that checking and adjusting this Android feature today can immediately provide. Like this video, if this complete, detailed, and genuinely important analysis of the Android feature that may be tracking your ad activity and exactly what you should check and change right now to protect your privacy gave you the specific knowledge, the practical navigation guidance, and the honest assessment of what this tracking system does and what your options for controlling it are that every Android user deserves to have before the advertising ecosystem has spent years building a comprehensive behavioral profile of their application usage that they had no idea was being created on their device. Subscribe to this channel for the kind of seriously researched, genuinely useful, and consistently privacy protective Android content that empowers ordinary users to understand and to control the data collection and the behavioral tracking that the applications and the operating systems they depend on conduct with or without their meaningful awareness. And tell me in the comments what you found when you checked your Android advertising settings for the first time, and whether you chose to delete your advertising ID, reset it, or leave it in place after understanding what it does and what the options for managing it are. See you in the next one.